Ready, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, I'm Florenz Plassmann. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, but I'm also a faculty member in the departments of Economics and Political Science. We have an election year, and there are lots of news about the elections. I don't want to talk about the 2020 election. I want to talk about one interesting area in voting theory, which is one of my areas of interest for research. One of the big questions is whether we should abolish the Electoral College and replace it with the popular vote. I don't want to talk much about the Electoral College. I want to talk about the popular vote. I want to see what can go wrong if we simply use the popular vote to elect the president. Now, let's go back to the top 3 candidates in the 2000 presidential election. Well, the 2000 presidential election happened 20 years ago. Many of our freshmen who joined OU this year weren't even born at that time, so it qualifies as history. I will be playing a little bit fast and loose with the data. So take this as a stylized example of what can go wrong using the 2000 presidential election as an example. So let's look at the 3 top candidates: George W. Bush, Al Gore, and Ralph Nader. Now, let's look at the voters. We had about 50 million Republicans voting for George W. Bush. Now, they ranked him first. Let's assume that all 50 million Republicans ranked Gore second and Ralph Nader third. That most certainly didn't happen, but remember, this is just a toy example. Now, we look at the Democrats. Had about 51 million Democrats. Al Gore got about 51 million votes. And let's assume that all 51 million, I shall drop that million from now on, all 51 Democrats ranked Gore first, Ralph Nader second, and George W. Bush third. And then we have the Green Party voters. Ralph Nader received about 3 million votes, so let's assume there were 3 Green Party voters. Let's assume they ranked Ralph Nader first, they ranked George W. Bush second, and Al Gore third. Now, if we use the popular vote or the plurality rule to determine the winner among these 104 voters, we see that Gore wins by the plurality rule. Okay, are we done? Well, if we look at the rankings a little bit more closer, then it turns out that Bush actually beats Gore if we look at all the voters who rank Bush ahead of Gore. So one might arguably say, well, Bush would be a better winner than Gore because there are 53 voters who rank Bush ahead of Gore and only 51 voters who rank Gore ahead of Bush. But Nader beats Bush 54 to 50. There are the Green Party voters and the Democrats, 54 voters who rank Nader ahead of Bush, so Nader would be the better president. But of course, Gore beats Nader 101 to 3, and so Gore would be the better candidate or the better president. But now we go back to the beginning where Bush beats Gore, and then Nader beats Bush, and Gore beats Nader, and we have what voting theorists call a voting cycle. No matter which candidate we choose as president, we choose a candidate who is beaten by someone else. And that is a general problem that we run into when we aggregate people's preferences in trying to come up with a collective decision. So we'll just have to live with it, but it points to a general problem of aggregating preferences and making collective choices. Now, let me play fast and loose with the data. Let's change the setup ever so slightly, and let's assume that there are 51 Republicans and 50 Democrats. And let's assume that the 3 voters for the Green Party rank Gore ahead of Bush. Okay? So let's go back to the popular vote. Now, Bush wins the popular vote. Bush gets the most votes, 51. It's more than 50. It's more than 3. But it turns out that Gore beats Bush 53 to 51. There are 53 voters who prefer Gore to Bush. And Gore also beats Nader 101 to 3. So arguably, Gore is the best candidate. Voting theorists would call him the Condorcet winner after the Marquis de Condorcet who came up with this concept. If there is a candidate who beats all other candidates in comparison, well, arguably, that person is the natural winner in this election. So the popular vote or the plurality rule does not necessarily pick the Condorcet winner if there is one. Now, if you look at the constellation, it gets even worse. We know that Gore beats Bush, but it turns out that Nader also beats Bush, because the Democrats and the Green Party voters ranked Bush last, and so there are 53 voters who rank Gore ahead of Bush and Nader ahead of Bush. So it turns out Bush is what's known as the Condorcet loser. It's a candidate who is beaten by every other candidate in the competition. And so arguably, Bush is not a natural winner here, but the popular vote, the plurality rule, chooses George W. Bush as the winner. So that's a problem. Now there's one other difficulty that we run into. Let's assume that the three voters from the Green Party look at their rankings and say, gee, if we vote honestly, then our last ranked choice is going to win. But if we switch our first and our second ranked choice, if we rank Gore ahead of Nader, well then Nader wins with 53 votes. So the Green Party voters could make themselves better off by not voting according to their true preferences, but by voting strategically. And you might say, what's wrong with that? And one possible answer is there's nothing wrong with that. But we could also say that the whole purpose of voting is not just to make a decision, but to make a good decision, to make the best decision. And if people don't tell us honestly what they want, well, how do we know that we have actually made the best decision? So could Gore really claim that most voters approve of his political agenda if we need to assume that, or if we need to be aware of the possibility that some voters may not have voted honestly? So ideally, we would want a voting rule where people find it hard to vote strategically so that we learn what people actually want. So is there a good alternative to the popular vote? Now let's go back to our very first example that most closely reflects the 2000 presidential election, and look at one of the alternatives that has become very popular in the news. It's known as ranked choice voting, or also instant runoff voting. And it's slightly more complicated than using the popular vote, but it's reasonably simple. It says, if a candidate is ranked first by a majority of the voters, that candidate wins. If there's no majority voter, then do something. And ranked choice voting says, eliminate the candidate with the fewest first ranks, and rewrite the ballots without this candidate. So take the candidate who is liked least and run the election without that person. So if we apply ranked choice voting, we realize that nobody wins a majority of the votes, which would be 53. We realize that Ralph Nader has the fewest first ranks, 3. So remove his name from the ballots and evaluate the ballots without his name. And so now we realize that given that the 3 voters in the Green Party ranked Bush second, now Bush wins with 53 votes. Of course, that's only one possible voting rule that we can use if we take the entire ranking into account. A very, very closely related rule is known as the Coombs Rule. And the Coombs Rule is very, very similar to ranked choice. It again starts by asking, does a candidate win the majority of the votes? If yes, that person wins. If not, then eliminate the candidate with the most last ranks. So the ranked choice voting eliminates the candidate with the fewest first ranked, the candidate who is liked least, and the Coombs Rule eliminates the candidate with the most last ranked, the candidate who is arguably despised most. That's an equally logical decision of how to proceed. And then we write the ballots without that candidate and see where this gets us. So if we apply it to our example, again, we find that nobody wins a majority of the votes. Now, Bush gets 51 last ranks, Nader gets 50, and Gore gets only 3. So remove Bush's name from the ballots and evaluate the ballots again. And now we realize that Al Gore gets 101 votes and wins the election. Okay. Well, there's obviously a lot more to say, but I don't want to tax your patience too much. So what should you take away from all of this? I think the first thing to take away from this is that a lot can go wrong if we simply were to replace the Electoral College with the popular vote. There are lots of alternatives to the popular vote. Now, the last example should have made you alert, because there is no voting rule that gets everything right. Different voting rules focus on different things, and there's a famous theorem in collective decisions called the arrow impossibility theorem that says there is no voting rule that gets everything right, and there can be no voting rule that gets everything right. So there is no perfect voting rule. What we have to do is we have to make do with imperfect voting rules. Okay. Now, the choice of voting rule matters. We saw in the last example that ranked choice voting picked Bush. The Coombs Rule picked Gore. Well, both were reasonable rules. We may have chosen either one at the outset, but the choice of the voting rule actually determined the outcome of the election. So which voting rule we use is an enormously important decision. Now, there's lots of research that needs to be done with respect to voting rule. So I'll leave you with the thought that more research in voting theory is needed. And of course, what would be a better place for more research in voting theory than Ohio University? Thank you very much.